The carrier stack will wrap up basically a 3-month research residency here at Trust, where I was thinking about planning economies and how they might be rethought from the point of non-human agency. So it is far from a formalized research architecture. I would say that the carrier stack is more an accidental microstructure that sort of emerged out of different lines of inquiry. And it obviously references Ursula Le Guin and her carrier bag of theory of fiction. So I want to think about the carrier stack as a mental review, an archive of stories, of concepts, of hypotheses and questions that went into basically also the design of an environmental tabletop game that I created as an output to the research residency. And so it does not only archive research from the past, but also it kind of harbors what is still in a state of becoming. And it's basically for me or for us also to think together as a vessel to, or as a container for different hypotheses and questions that might engineer new games. So the carrier stack basically engineers games, but in this format, we will reverse engineer it back. Yes. So I will start off with the first cluster, which is games to win and games to play. So one of the difficulties or sort of main challenges that I saw in creating this game is was creating a game without a winning condition, and I want to sort of cycle back to what the different strands of thought were that went into that. So a lot of the thinking around games was inspired by the cultural theorist and media philosopher Willem Flusser, who defined human communication as an artificial process. So that it draws from artistry, Kunstgriffe, and inventions on tools and instruments, and those are symbols which are ordered as codes. And one way to decode or decrypt those codes would be games. So for Flusser, actually, games were models of being in the world, and the human player sees themselves basically as the intersection or at the intersection of a set of different games. And for me, it was sort of the project was to expand the player. Not just to have like a purely human player, but to see how can basically you rethink the player as a human, non-human symbiosis. And so what Flusser also asked was not necessarily from what premises decisions were made, but what were the endpoints or the effects of those decisions and how were they made. So I really got, this is a bit of a big, I don't know, detour, but this was basically the question of really having maybe not a condition, but how do you still create a sort of pathway or narrative that you can find to actually make decisions, because the goal or some form of endpoint or narrative can shape those decisions and how they are made. And so in many of these games, of course, also the decision structure is not really in your hands or how it might be changed. So for an example would be Monopoly, actually, where the first patent of the game, the Landlord's game, actually by Elizabeth Maggie, was actually created to show the effects of Ricardian rent and also to allow for space to think about Henry George's notion of a proposal of single value tax for land. And today, of course, we know it more as this cutthroat race to become the richest and most powerful player. But, for example, we see that there's also commons poly, which tries to sort of switch that back and to return to the original intent of the game, where basically you're running against time or playing against time, which is 20 rounds, where you have to turn private goods into public or common goods. And another inspiration or anti-inspiration was also Civilization, which has actually 5 different winning conditions: science, culture, domination, religion, diplomacy, or score. But what I actually noticed was that these are somehow still algorithms that follow a linear progress. And a lot of the inspiration also for this project came from actually reading Lynn Margulis, who in an essay with her son called Futures wrote, "Life may not progress, but it expands. Indulging the human mind's penchant for categorical choices, and in keeping with our assignment to assess the future, we indulge in forecasts for humanity. Either there will be a catastrophic nuclear war that destroys our technologies, or our technologies will control themselves so that, with machines, we begin reproducing in outer space. If the former occurs, people will vanish from the biosphere, global ecology will shift, and the biosphere will evolve in curious directions. It will not be a victory for humanity. However, if we survive our threat of nuclear war and become a multi-planet civilization, reproducing in outer space, this too will not necessarily be a victory for humanity. It will be a further expansion of the biosphere, a victory for the biota, for the nexus of all life, including machines." So basically, my question was then, what if there was no algorithm for progress as expansion? And how do we think of a game progressing and expanding without any progress? So that was actually a really tough challenge in the game, because for me it was trying to dwell within this balance of keeping keeping an equilibrium between agency and externality, but in some way I didn't calibrate it right enough or correctly, or not, I don't know, tight enough, so that actually what happened was that it turned into quite the feudal or neoliberal scenario. So what I learned actually, and what would also be my proposal for engineering new games, is to create these narratives, but these need to be created collectively also. So I was just wondering, because you also create games, how you would sometimes, or what could be like possible strategies of creating this narrative that somehow feels like you didn't create it by yourself, but still you need some kind of structure, because otherwise normally players will just project their own ideas into this game. So, for example, I didn't give an overall narrative, so people just tried to mine as many resources and hoard them, and didn't necessarily build any infrastructure with them. And then in the end they were like, oh, okay, now we have all this aluminium and this uranium, and didn't use it, basically. So, yeah.
I think the idea of expansion without progress is super interesting, and we have. I feel like in our discussion you were mentioning a little bit Karen Barad, and she's connecting. She's connecting her thought with quantum physics, and I think that somehow the idea of physics and or quantum physics, and how hard it is for us humans to even start to comprehend it, but we still somehow need to find words to explain that. That's maybe a good point where we could start thinking from, in a sense. And that being said, I think we could do that maybe with using a quantum physics that wouldn't be with vitalist sort of urge, because I think like if you have a vitalist approach to quantum physics, then you bring back the idea of progress. So for instance, like a vitalist angle to quantum physics would be the idea that there is this kind of force behind everything that's kind of like drive it to reproduce certain pattern and go with an idea of progression. So, for instance, let's say that, and to go a bit away from this idea of quantum physics, if you put certain bacteria in a certain context, then they will start creating life. That's kind of this idea. And I think if you remove that idea of progress from that, then you start to have an interesting thought, I think, because and one of the things that again is interesting is that it's almost impossible for us not to read pattern or signs of idea of expansion without reading a meaning into it, or kind of like this idea of like giving meanings to movement, to plane movements. So for us, as soon as something happens, then it carries a signification in a sense. So we have to work with something that is pretty much like almost like built in our system. For instance, Eduardo Kohn in How Forests Thinks is saying that there is like 3 types of signs, and by signs he means like something which stands to somebody for something in some respect of or capacity. And he's saying that the first sign is basically iconic, so it's a sign that has a likeness to what it represents, and something very that we can all understand. For instance, it's like this kind of words that you have in language that are almost sonically very similar to what they represent. For instance, like if you say a splash, you will immediately, I think sonically, it has something very similar to actually a splash in the water. And therefore, it almost transcends this idea of like of language as an abstraction. So that would be iconic. Indexical is another type of sign, which is kind of like more to do with cause and effect. So something happens, let's say a tree fall, and as human, we cannot help but seeing that tree falling as some kind of signifier for something. The tree is falling because. So we again like push some kind of notion of meaning onto something that is maybe just a tree falling. And then of course you have the third one that is the symbolic, that is mainly language, where the sign basically relates to an object. So if we say a glass relates to that object, the glass, only in relation to the set of rules that we created for that language. And I think basically that's kind of like the main, I would say, obstacle for thinking like expansion without progress. Because when we see movement, the first thing we do is thinking, oh, there is movement, therefore there must be a cause for the movements, and that cause must be a progress. Like, So maybe I would argue that it's almost something that you shouldn't fight, or you should acknowledge, but maybe work with rather than work against, in a sense. And again, I think it comes back to this idea that you, like what you were saying, like you don't want to create that narrative for the players, but at the same time, you kind of need to create a narrative for the player, right? Because you don't want them to just stack things for the sake of stacking things. But maybe, so if we take in consideration the fact that as human, we always push meaning into things, then maybe we could try to bring that idea of language in itself. And I think that's where this very fundamental of movement, or the idea of a word that immediately means something and you know what it means because it's so close to somehow that action, maybe we could go into that kind of zone where, like, I think it would be very interesting to think of a game where there would be no language, for instance, where you would have to you're not allowed to talk, and maybe the only way you can talk is by movement, or maybe by hissing, or maybe by so really that you put the player in a state of play that is so far removed that you don't even need that vocabulary that is so much in the way of us playing, because this vocabulary is so much informed by the way we construct the world, or we see the world. So maybe that would be interesting to think of, maybe almost a semi-telepathic / pantomime way of playing a game, where you would be doing this weird gesture in terms of exchange, in a sense. And that maybe brings us back to the idea of context or story, or and I think there was something interesting that you were mentioning, this idea of, and now you didn't mention it, but this idea of wherefore, from Flusser. And I'm not really familiar with him, but I feel like this is such a mindfuck word, in a sense. Wherefore. So it's not about from where you come from, it's more like for where you come from.
Yeah, for what basically we decide. So it's basically something that he sees as contingent on the intention of the sender. So in some way, because he really saw games as, and I use games now, of course I also created this very material game, but I see games really as this model of being in the world, or being able to sort of deconstruct it through that medium. And so sometimes, for him, basically, the sender, normally the messages from the sender, they sort of oscillate between the two extremes of redundancy and banality. So Flusser's always really good at opening up dualisms and then in the same sort of strain also to dissolve those again. So basically it's a form of, so banality or redundancy would be maximum information, and banality or banality could lead into basically insanity in some way. And so my question was how could we maybe not, I'm really into this idea, by the way, of removing language at all, in a board game setting. But I was also thinking of how can we extend different terms, and what would that how would that change the game itself? For example, if we don't have growth or sort of death or these sort of terms, but for example, Lynn Margulis would also say that populations grow, and when they become too numerous, they normally perish or they transcend. So what if we put also maybe, these are also terms which are sort of overladen with meaning, but still, what would it change if we sort of created a game structure between perishability and transcendence in some way? And how could we rethink, that was basically the broad part, the interaction between carbon-based life forms and also silicon-based life forms, as a way of how do players maybe emerge out of the sort of environment or setting. And we had thought of, for example, creating what I was thinking to extend the game now, how you could have the player become the action, basically, so that you acquire different abilities and then you turn into an autotroph or an saprotroph or something, and exactly. That it's sort of not this unit of being that is already conditioned from the beginning, but that sort of changes through. Yeah.
I think that's a very interesting idea, this kind of this goal as a story almost, or this kind of it almost feels like the temporality, it's on its head in a sense with this idea, which I think it could be very good into thinking characters, or what is a character is in action. I think that's and in a sense it is, because it's all about mining. So there is this idea of transition always, like, or like this idea of like, in order to produce aluminium, you will mix these different things together, and then that will produce aluminium. I'm not entirely familiar with the with the technicality of producing aluminium, but maybe one of the other things that I wanted to introduce also in relation to this kind of unsustainable accumulative behavior that that you were like that occurred during the game is the idea of negative value that Jason de Beaulieu explains in his book Capitalism in the Way of Life. So in a sense, it's kind of the idea that accumulation or cannot really happen without like a kind of sorry, I'm touching the microphone, the kind of like negative side of it. And I think that's a part that is very often forgotten in game, or conveniently forgotten. And if you look at game like Civilization, for instance, sometimes, like, I mean, it's all about producing and accumulating and expanding, but at the same time, the system is very conveniently avoiding a lot of subjects, like how is that actually happening? Or the game is based so much on like, at some point you will need to found a city on another continent because you will need that resources. What is the actual cost of that? So it would be interesting in bringing this idea that maybe each time you accumulate, there is a hidden cost that is maybe, I don't know, the emotional labor of turning plants into petrol or something. Really, so giving like kind of like recalibrating and giving the real cost of everything, like time, for instance. That's something I've been like thinking a lot in relation to your game also, because there is so much of this thing that take eons to happen. Like I think petrol takes like millennia.
Yeah.
Or so, to
Millions
just
of years. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So how do you translate that into a game when you talk about time span that are like so huge? So in de facto, if you're talking from a perspective of non-human, you cannot really accumulate petrol in so quick. So yeah, I think that would be interesting to really play about like looking really at those actual negative costs of salvage accumulation and really giving them as a way to keep people in check, in a sense. So it's not a storyline, but still it's kind of like steering or having a clear agenda in the game design somehow.
Yeah, I think this idea of assigning value to, or actually accounting for that negative value is a really good introduction to the next sort of cluster of thoughts, or the next layer in the stack, which is trying to think about planning reproductive economies. So really, I mean, in that game, in games, we simulate certain environments, and we also sometimes show how different actions themselves produce environments, and how then actually these systems of the game, if we keep them open enough, when it's not a game where you have a certain rule book, like Monopoly or something, but if we create like more open world building games that actually then systems emerge somehow from all of these accumulated planned and unplanned decisions, whether those are centrally controlled or somehow co-evolving in a distributed manner. And I wanted in this game also to really look at reproduction as a sort of center of gravity, which is why I also sometimes thought maybe the game was a bit redundant, because basically what you did was you mined resources, then you used them to grow your cyber fungi body, and transformed also your body as infrastructure. So there was like the only difference that could be sort of achieved was by manipulating sort of repeating patterns. And so I've been really looking into basically reproduction and thinking about like if I would create a new game or try to re-engineer the game, then how does one create a design brief where the center or the focus is not production itself, but reproduction? And I suppose that a lot of the theory behind that is really, of course, indebted to Silvia Federici, who also says that has a very lucid or articulates a very lucid critique of Marx, that she says that actually 5 centuries of capitalist development have not sort of created the material conditions for communism, but actually have just depleted the resources on the planet. And so she argues that Marx largely ignored the labor involved in reproducing the subject, who was actually at the heart of revolutionary struggle, and that we need to extend these analyses to the area of reproduction as part of production as well. As you can see also in the diagrams, the two are codependent. And actually I found this sort of resonated really well with a different, with another quote by Lynn Margulis and Dorian Sagan, where they say that only the organic macromolecules of DNA and RNA are capable of reproduction in the replicative sense. In one act of synthesis, they make complementary copies of themselves. All else, so cells, boys, elephants, trees, McDonald's, and the branches of the Chase Manhattan Bank, they do not directly reproduce, but it takes a lot of molecular replication, cell growth, development, and construction, so that 2 cells, 2 boys, 2 elephants, 2 trees, or 2 McDonald's and 2 bank branches can appear in the biosphere, where before there was only one. And so I was really thinking about also the reproduction with machines, because I think that Federici is quite adamant about rethinking technology or thinking against computerization, because for her there was really no technological leap that has occurred in the sphere of domestic work, so actually reproductive labor, reducing the socially necessary labor to reproduce the white worker. But I'd actually really like to synthesize or bring basically her critique of through reproduction back onto technology. And I think that actually her case studies that she sees in communities or the commons could actually really be applied, or also her critique of reproduction to, for example, also the fragment on machines by Marx, which is a part of Grundrisse, where the basic or the argument that is often excavated from that is that the accumulation of scientific and technical skills and knowledge forms something that he calls the general intellect, and that actually only occurs once in Grundrisse, but that general intellect has sort of taken on a life of its own, and that this general intellect is then absorbed into capital, specifically fixed capital, as machinery. So the main argument here often is that with this information in economy and this general intellect which has accumulated, the exploitation of labor becomes secondary. So that basically capitalism is dissolving in some way. But I would actually say that this general intellect needs to be reproduced. And this machinery that he saw in trains, and but also like which you could extend to telecommunication networks, and also large knowledge repositories, they are all embodied in material. Mm-hmm. So I think that actually you can really you can reread the fragment on machines through Federici's notion of reproductive labor, because he also, in one other quote, he says that nature builds no machines, no locomotives, no railways, no electric telegraphs, or self-acting mules. These are products of human industry, natural material transformed into organs of the human will over nature, or of human participation in nature. They are organs of the human brain and created by the human hand, the power of knowledge. And I think that is a theme that you can also see in Capital, where he actually describes the craftsmanship of a worker as opposed to a bee, where he says that the bee doesn't have an image of what it's making beforehand. And you can see that there's really this sort of like asymmetric tilt to the human, where yes, of course, the technosphere as we know it, that is part of the biosphere, is largely human-made, but it is also made through the reproductive labor of non-human actors, of plants. And so I've been really thinking about actually how to extend this value that is salvaged. I mean, that the salvage accumulation is also a term by Anna Tsing, who with this identifies that capital is really good at exploiting or absorbing all the value that it can't create on its own. And so actually what is being salvage accumulated is really this sort of chain or litany of human reproductive labor, but also the reproductive capacities of billions of years of geological processes and life forms resisting death by ingestion, as Lynn Margulis would say, that give birth, live, and decay, and then are forced down under by tectonic shifts. And so we need to look, I think, at these patterns and this dissolution of molecules, the exchange of compounds, the transformation of energy in all of these relations. And we need to inquire them as part also of the reproductive labor that is exploited through capitalist modes of extraction. And perhaps we could use this interdependency that we have with the machine that is being reproduced by the biota and vice versa as a way to reformulate that sort of struggle of a form of, I call this reproduction with critters and machines, but I guess that's still open to, I don't know, for design. And so I guess that was basically the strand of or the train of thoughts that went into this. And I think that I'd like to create a sort of design brief for future games on planning economies with this, but the question is, how do you account for all of this, and what are the right ways to account for this? Because there's also this idea in economics of earth system services, where you basically allocate a price or value to all the different processes that are, or the value generated by our ecological systems. That, for example, you could say, yes, so the total economic value that is created by pollination through bees, for example, is 153 billion euro. But how do you pay it to the bees? Mm-hmm. And how do we create sort of systems around that? Which often, and is that also the right strategy to value all of that? But then if the systems sort of scale themselves, maybe we need to scale other systems to keep pace with them. So yeah, it's a very open question, as you can see, but the question is, like, how do we create design briefs that look at reproduction with the forced labor, or that is part of the plantationocene, as Haraway or Tsing would say, with plants, animals, microbes, fungi, and minerals.
Yeah, I think it's exactly, I think we're really at the core of this, basically what we were talking about earlier, this negative value sort of thing, right? It's kind of like all the labor that the capitalist system will not take in consideration, like how do you pay the bees, for instance, is a very good example of that, or do you even pay it? But the fact is that as of now, we don't have in the system, we cannot take in consideration even that question of actually, like, you cannot put value on everything, basically. So there is like a lot to unpack in what you say, and I think it's very interesting. There is a couple of points that I wanted to touch on, maybe in relation also put a little bit like, because I think what is happening now is like we're putting a lot of, we're looking at a lot of like natural like system, or Lynn Margulis is talking a lot about not symbiotic, but she's looking a lot at science fact to kind of like, and then we're expanding it in a more political direction. And I wanted to just put that in relation to Dawkins and the idea of the selfish gene, as kind of like this idea of so basically the idea of the selfish gene is kind of like that all cells are competing to survive, and they will do that despite the others. And this model has been used to kind of justify a lot of political decisions that have been taken in the capitalist system, basically. So survival of the fittest versus survival of the fitting. And I think it's interesting that Morton kind of, and maybe that's where I look back at the idea of reproduction, noticed that the idea of sexual reproduction, so not reproduction in the sense of like duplication, but really a sexual reproduction, is actually a very expensive process of reproducing. So if the gene is selfish and only wants its own survival, then the ultimate way of for life to reproduce would not be sexual, because that's not the most efficient way, in a sense. There's so much I want to talk about in relation to what you just said. I think it would be super interesting to somehow look at the idea of the common or squat or self-organization as a way, and like kind of project that into semi-machinic kind of system. And one of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking about this was the Dunbar number, which is kind of like this idea that the human brain is above all a social brain. So it's a brain that is based on our social interaction, and we have a database of 150 people that we can store. So as a human brain, the average that we can store is around 150 people. Some people have more, some people have less, but the average is kind of that. And I think that would be interesting to look at that kind of system as model for the game, because what is noticing several things in relation to that. One of the things that is noticing is how much we reproduce that social pattern everywhere in the way we organize ourselves. So it's kind of like, how can I say that? So it's not about the way we organize ourselves, it's about the number of organizations. So if you look at governments, for instance, you have very often a prime minister or president. And around that, you have like very often like 15 to 17 minister type of people. And then you have the parliament that is around 100. And then you have like, so it's kind of like the system of representation is all based on like that number of database that you have. So as a human being, very often your close friends are close to 15 to 17 people. And then you extend the circle of acquaintance like that, in a sense. So this is the way we perceive and we kind of like deal with like our connection. And I think that would be interesting to also include non-humans in that as a thought. And maybe that's where anthropomorphizing is coming in. But he's also, I think, deducing something from that. He's saying that the tool is actually a result of this social brain, basically, because, and he's giving as an example cooking. The fact is we were so busy being social with each other that we needed to have shortcuts, so we would not take so much time digesting, because like digesting raw meats or like raw food is taking a lot of time. So basically we cooked, and the cooking process is a way of pre-digesting your food. And so I think the idea that technology and tools are a highly social highly social structure, and this in relation to the game, and maybe where I want to go with that is, what if we take somehow this thing that we know are inherent to the human brain, this structure of like numbers, and we kind of fuse it a little bit with Lynn Margulis' ideas, and again, not the idea that you work against the human nature, but with it, and you kind of like create that fusion, and that as a kind of like support for organizing the game. So thinking that maybe each human has like a capacity to have a close relationship in a given context with 15 people, and that if it's more than 15, it's going to be really hard for that person to follow through a conversation or follow through a narrative. So how can you build that game based on those two? Like, how can you make these two systems click, not in a perfect way, because it will never be perfect, but in a way that can be like useful and comprehensible for us to like work through those different contexts in a sense. I think that was kind of...
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, and I think we had also spoken about the Dunbar number in relation to, okay, is it possible to reduce the essence of human nature to this number? And I remember there was also this quite the famous debate between Noam Chomsky and Foucault, actually, like in the maybe 90s, 80s, 70s? Yeah? When was that? So, but actually, maybe I don't know whether everyone agrees, but Chomsky sort of lost the debate because he kept on insisting that there is like this essence and human nature, and there's this human nature that we can sort of always go back to, and that's also maybe the question. Maybe we can use something like those 150 connections sort of as a base, and then see how we could actually change that. Like, for example, if we create a tool in one of that to create another repository of like another 150 connections, then that might be also a possibility to extend that. And that's, I think, also what I wanted to think about, is in extending like our connections, our interdependencies with non-human entities. That I think Anna Tsing's book really beautifully shows how the repercussions of the military industrial complex sort of interacts with fungi that sort of sprout in a forest that is trying to survive human ecological devastation, and how that also is filtered through supply chains. And I think that could be an interesting way of also creating, I don't know exactly how to model this within a game, but this could also be maybe a way to think about through this database and expand it in like small pockets.
Yeah, I think that would be. I was reading through my notes, and I was like, maybe then if we kind of like use those kind of ideas of this kind of database really as a way, just as a departure. And I think it's very important what you're saying, that it's a support, but that's something that maybe can change or evolve or like turn itself on the head. And I was thinking about like, how do you have then if you would kind of start to including non-humans into that database, right? Then you also extend the idea of maybe, in a sense, the idea of like a family, or the idea of responsibility. Like, what if you extend the idea of responsibility to a rock or something? Or like, how can that switch, in a sense, the whole way of gaming and organizing the game? That's what
I think that's a super nice sort of segue into the next cluster that we were talking through. Oh no, I forgot the animation. Oh. No. Maybe, okay, I'll just jump to the next. You also spoke of anthropomorphizing as a strategy to include non-human or critters into our repository because it's so difficult as well. That was something that I kept running against. Like, are fungi for us really like a form of like epistemological field, or are we just sort of misusing them as, or using them as metaphors in some way? And that was also something that we had spoken about extensively, like how do you think about the non-human and the perceptive abilities if you are sort of caught in a human body, and we are inhabiting a human body, and we have specific forms of senses, and that's, I think, also where we might say that we can bring technology back into this, because that is the only way that we, in some ways, understand molecular interdependencies that fungi have. So there's this quote by Catherine Hales in Computing the Human, where she says that researchers with the greatest stake in developing these objects, so it's mostly artificial intelligence, consistently use a rhetoric that first takes human behavior as the inspiration for machine design, and then in a reverse feedback loop reinterprets human behavior in light of the machines. And I would like to extend machines as maybe also scientific apparatus, so that this scientific apparatus somehow allows us to rethink this triangulation between human and non-human. And there's also a quote by Haraway in an interview with Anna Tsing on the Plantationocene, where they say that it's ironic in a way that these apparatuses of biology, which are always critiqued as being so or being accused of reductionism, that they also allow for the demonstration of mutualisms at every level of being. So that the example that they have there is that today it is possible to study chemical and ultrastructural detail, the cues for larval settlement from a bacterium releasing a molecule that can be discriminated in the water column at such and such dilution, that can interact at such and such a time in developmental history, and result in settlement and metamorphosis of a particular invertebrate, and so forth. And these things were not possible to sort of show or confirm before, technically, but still knowing them matters. And I'd like to maybe present also some readings of studies by Toby Kears, who's in Amsterdam and who collaborated with a chemist called Matthew Whiteside. And they actually wanted to understand the distribution of nutrients through mycorrhizal networks, which is basically just fungi, mycelium around tree roots, for example, or plant roots. And it's actually quite interesting because, for one, there was this technological development of quantum dot tagging nutrients. So they could tag phosphorus, for example, and have very artificial yet still interesting experimental designs where they would have carrot root and then a fungus, and that they would measure with the quantum dots how the fungus moved nutrients through the own network, but also how that then went on to the carrot root, for example. So they could actually quantum dot phosphorus with like different colors, and then through by analyzing the fluorescence, see how those movements sort of developed over time. And I think something else that is interesting is that actually what they used was a lot of economic terms, which is also this aspect of unease that I sort of feel with this. So there's something actually called biological market theory, and so they use trading and prices and trade-offs as terms to discuss the results of these very artificial experimental designs, and that they say, yeah, what you could see is that actually with higher resource inequality, the fungi root actually exchanged more or moved more nutrients through the network, which was not what they expected. So they actually saw that, for example, purple dot phosphorus would move to the side where there was, so one side, for example, had little nutrients and the other more, so that the rich regions actually moved a lot of phosphorus into the poor regions. And so their hypothesis basically is that in those poor regions, they get higher rewards of carbon from the plant root. But it's incredibly difficult to prove because it's yet impossible to quantum dot tag carbon. So what they do is that they measure basically the biomass of fungi, because they are biotrophs, so the only carbon that they can get is from the plant. But still, I think it's super interesting how they show that actually what they show is that the behavior or the relations of symbiosis or mutualism are contingent on the environment itself. Because that resource inequality actually was what changed the behavior to moving more nutrients across the network, or maybe also, and they also saw that actually in conditions of resource inequality or higher resource inequality, that the fungus would trade more with or that's how they term it, trade more, exchange nutrients with the tree root or the carrot root. And what I actually think is interesting is how we can take market terms to interpret fungi, but maybe also we should construct a reverse feedback loop back. So what does it mean if we see this form of biological relation as a trade? And what can that tell us about economic relations, or how could we co-opt that back? So more than, there's of course an anthropomorphizing of the fungi, but how can we mycelially morphize ourselves or our economic thinking? And it's of course also a super fine line, because what Lynn Margulis actually tried all her life was to emancipate biological terms from their economic ones, where she, in an essay called Words as Battle Cries, she actually laments that the biological term symbiosis has always been used either economically or politically, so that actually there was really little funding in biology to look at symbiosis. And for her, symbiosis as well is a huge evolutionary driver. She sees it as a much greater force in evolution than the accumulation of chance mutation, for example. And that she thinks it's so silly that we use economic terms such as mutually beneficial, which are so difficult to prove, as we could see in the research designs by Toby Kears and her affiliates, that it's really silly that we use it in such a sense, because fungi and these biological phenomena of, for example, symbiosis, have preceded by eons the human world, and also the invention, for example, of money. So with all these arguments, I think there's this really fine line where we can use cultural analogies in some way, because she herself, or Lynn Margulis herself, she uses, for example, wars as a way to describe, for example, the emergence through symbiosis. So, for example, she sees life itself as an uneasy truce between warring organisms. So, for example, that actually that cell movement, including the movements leading to thought, are the spoils of ancient microbial battles. She shows that, for example, also with how plants were actually were able to perform photosynthesis, is that plants attack chloroplasts, which were often could perform photosynthesis, and these chloroplasts actually resisted death by ingestion. So they were ingested into the plant, and that's how this form of life emerged. And I think that it's really interesting that there's still this metaphor of war and an uneasy truce, But I think that's also maybe the question of where does a metaphor become representational? Where does it obscure maybe also what we're trying to look at? But then also maybe the metaphor itself or the use of the use of this language mirrors more maybe also of maybe also our understanding of ourselves and the world. So yeah, this is a big cluster, but I think that if knowing these things or these mutualisms through technology or mediated through technology, if that matters, then we really need to think about these aesthetic practices of how do we extend our perceptions, and how do we also create new forms of understanding between that, where we always also ask ourselves, okay, what does it actually mean now if I use the movement or the nutrient distribution in fungi as a mechanism for the game? Am I anthropomorphizing the fungus, or maybe I'm also fungi morphizing myself? But yeah.
Yeah, I think it's and it's interesting that you talk about this symbiosis that was underfunded when you look at Dawkins, that had that very opposite reading on like evolution, and that those kind of reading are like the majority. So we kind of like need almost to like rewrite entirely the way of looking at interaction in nature without this economic, or maybe with it, but in a different way. I just remembered when you were talking about, and I'm not entirely sure of the term yet, but Donna Haraway is using a very interesting tool when she talks about research. Actually, I think it's subjective knowledge. So it's kind of the idea that I don't know if it's subjective or situated.
Situated knowledge.
Exactly,
yeah.
situated. Yeah. And it's kind of the idea that the context is everything, and she's giving like the framework in which she deploys that term is kind of like she's looking at analysis of chimpanzees that has been done over the years, and who did that, who, like if it was for instance a male researcher or a female researcher, and what kind of visibility was given to the female chimpanzee in the study, basically. And she was noticing that it's not so much about the fact that the study is rigorous or not, like things happen and you report them. It's about like the context that you create around that study, and which kind of vocabulary and emphasis you deploy when you do that. So in a sense, this idea of situated knowledge is about being out when you do this kind of study and being, okay, this is my context, that's what I'm interested in. When I do a study, I'm acknowledging that maybe I'm interested in the mother figure, the dynamic in the chimpanzee group, for instance, because of this and this reason. But the facts are still pretty much there. And I think that's a very interesting way where you just kind of like make the context hyper visible in a sense. To come back a little bit to this idea of symbiosis and anthropomorphizing, I think one of the dangers that you have with that is also putting the idea of moral in it, right? So it's kind of like, even when you have war, when you use a war analogy, I think there is an idea of moral and good and bad, and I think when thinking about mushroom and the different type of mushroom and how they feed, how they get their nutrients, it's very interesting because, and I think that's why mycelium is so interesting, because it's very subversive in what it does, right? Because some mushroom literally kill the plant that they're parasiting, and some mushroom will carry information from a tree that will kill another tree. So it's really, it goes beyond that idea of moral, but it's still a symbiotic relationship in a sense. You know, they're like, using each other. And I think this is a great example that you gave with chloro. How do you say that?
Chloroplast.
Yeah, exactly.
Cyanobacteria, actually. Then, yeah.
Because it's kind of like you really see the limit of language here, literally. Like, how is that really an attack when, you know, things get ingested? Or how can you even how can we even begin to sort of talk about this kind of thing? And even like in the game, you're talking a lot about the idea of mining minerals. What would be a word I would not be using? Like, again, it's very economical terms that you start to mine minerals. So how can we avoid using those vocabularies that keep on coming back, basically? That's sort of like are sort of this framework we can't really escape from. And I think maybe that's where metaphor is indeed like a thin line that is kind of like useful. And I think anthropomorphizing is also very useful, but it's so easy to fall into one way, like one side or the other. I really like this tool of anthropomorphizing, because it's a way, I think, where we start to create empathy with inanimate objects or things that are not us or animals, by being like, oh, it's probably feeling like this. Or, I mean, I think we have a dog in the room at the moment, and I'm pretty sure we all anthropomorphized that dog when it was there. Oh yeah, like, oh no, like, oh, he's doing this or that. Or so I think it's a very good way to make us care about things and to make us like to draw our attention to it. So in a sense, it's a healthy tool, and that's a tool that I don't think we can really escape in a sense. But at the same time, yes, it's a problem, because when you do that, you start to bring in the idea of moral. You start to bring in with the mechanism of anthropomorphizing, you have like a whole set of how do you say, background noise that come with it, basically, which is like, putting an economical vocabulary into something like a transaction, or like, I don't even have a word for that, like into two elements interacting with each other. What to do?
I think that's super interesting that you name elements, because actually for Flusser's games as models of being in this world, basically he defines it really, or I mean, it's quite obvious, but games are basically where elements are handled according to rules, and maybe we could think of language as these rules, because they are actually what connected. So I think in some way, yes, it's problematic to maybe use words such as mine, but also in some way it represents the violence that is inherent in that action, because actually billions of years went into dying plants that then percolated through the soil and were forced under by tectonic plates, and all of these processes, and bringing that back up is like, there's this figure of the challenger and Arthur Conan Doyle, which it actually makes an appearance also in Deleuze and Guattari's Thousand Plateaus and the Geology of Morals, and they sort of inhabit that challenger dude, who's really the science dude that tries to show, the Earth, it doesn't know that I'm here, but me, the Professor Challenger, wants to show the Earth that, or make the Earth scream. And so what he actually does is, I don't know, it's like this tube, so it's also very, very phallic in some way, that he sort of forces into the nerve ganglion of the Earth, so into the core, and the Earth screeches. And basically, with that act, Challenger showed his grandiosity of being this person who challenges Earth. And I think Okay, someone's cheering on that. And I actually think that it's also kind of course, it's problematic that these stories are still being told. I mean, they are very much the time-killing arrow that Ursula Le Guin talks about, and we really want to go, or like, we have to look probably at the carrier bags of that. And I think the carrier bags are maybe all that reproductive labor that was created of like human and non-human actors that actually made it possible to force this tube down and bring those resources up. And in that way, sometimes I feel like these terms or this vocabulary is representational because it is violent, and without saying that all life is violent, in some way life is violent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I also think it's okay to acknowledge that the vocabulary we have is going to be imperfect, but we need it in a sense to foray into those kind of ideas, to start foraging. And even like the fact that you're saying, okay, I'm going to go for it, mycelium morphizing. It's kind of like, it's important that we want to do that, even if we are not managing to do it. Like the idea that we can open, and I think that's where science is a really good tool to even help us like reconsider all these things that we think are functioning a certain way, but actually maybe, you know, like how phosphor is moving along the mycelium network. Maybe that's one thing that I wanted to introduce, because I don't think, I mean, I understand that some of the use we use for like mycelium, it's useful and we use it as a metaphor, but I think 先 in game I wanted to introduce another idea, that maybe it's more about like that because we try to inhabit, like especially in your game, it's more about telling ghost stories almost, in a sense. That maybe the game is about being possessed, in a sense that maybe, you know, like the exorcist being possessed. So in a way, you're like, when we are playing your game, we are truly being possessed by all these non-human things, not because like the non-humans come in it, but maybe because the ghosts of what they are to us or what they mean are coming in the game. In a sense, we are being haunted by all these non-human things constantly because of ecological disaster. So maybe this is more about a game of possession, in a sense, that we have to play. Like, or maybe that this game it's not so much a metaphor than just being like, okay, I'm truly, in order to understand what the fuck is going on, I need to be possessed by that entity and just play as a human, play that entity. So knowing that I'm still human, but I'm kind of possessed. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically like LARPing.
Exactly. So, and I think that's something a little bit different than just like metaphors, in a sense. It goes a bit further than that, because here you're not only trying to like use something like an image for something in order to kind of try to understand and apply it to another system. You're just kind of like inhabiting that thing, in a sense, or trying to inhabit that thing. So it's like, I feel like it's a little bit different, and maybe that's a bit more interesting, maybe than just use it as a plain like metaphor.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really great. I think that there's no way of ending the carrier stack, because it's basically this container of concepts and stories that keep retelling, and maybe it's also a weird methodology, but I mean, it's also a way of talking about something without talking about it. So it might also be very confusing not to know the game, but then having us talk the entire time about the game, it feels like it's really this ghost that we are trying to get to possess you. But we hope that, well, the carrier stack is a bit like the rhizome, and that people can sort of just punctuate it where they want and then take from it what they can. And so I think we'll end it here, and then we'll have a short reshuffling of the setting, and then we can still openly discuss, maybe. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.